12 men walked away from everything. One left his fishing nets on the shore of Galilee still wet from the morning catch. Another walked away from a tax collector's booth in Capernaum mid-transaction. Another left a political movement he had given his entire life to. They left careers, families, incomes and futures. They followed a teacher from Nazareth who had no army, no political office, and no property to his name. 3 years later, that teacher was executed by the Roman state. And here is what happened next. Not one of them ran. Not one of them quietly returned to their former life, rebuilt their reputation, and spent their remaining years pretending the whole thing had never happened. Instead, every single one of them went out into the most dangerous corners of the known world. Rome, Ethiopia, India, Persia, Greece, and kept telling the same story. The story that had already gotten their teacher killed. And one by one, almost all of them were killed for it too. Here is what most people never realize about that fact. The deaths of the apostles are not just a footnote in church history. They are one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire historical conversation about whether the resurrection of Jesus actually happened. Because people will die for something they believe to be true, but people do not willingly die for something they know to be a lie. These men were not dying for a doctrine. They were dying for a specific event they claimed to have personally witnessed. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video you will know exactly how each apostle died, which accounts are historically reliable and which ones are legend, and you will understand why one apostle, just one, made it to old age and died in his bed. The world these men walked into after the resurrection was not a world that tolerated what they were saying. The Roman Empire in the 1st century AD was a machine of extraordinary efficiency and extraordinary brutality. It controlled roughly 70 million people across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It maintained that control through a combination of law, taxation, military force, and the cult of the emperor. To claim that a Jewish carpenter executed by Roman authority had risen from the dead and was the rightful lord of all creation was not just a religious statement. It was a political one. It was a direct challenge to the authority of Caesar. The Jewish religious establishment had its own reasons to silence the movement. The apostles were preaching in the temple courts, in the synagogues, in the public squares of Jerusalem, and the message they were preaching, that the Sanhedrin had handed the Messiah over to be crucified, was an accusation that could not be allowed to stand. Here is the detail most people walk right past. The very first persecution of the early church did not come from Rome. It came from Jerusalem, from the same religious leadership that had orchestrated the trial of Jesus. Acts 4 records Peter and John being arrested for preaching in the temple. Acts 5 records all the apostles being arrested, flogged and ordered to stop. Acts 7 records Stephen being stoned to death. And Acts 12 records the moment the persecution turned lethal for the apostles themselves. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 AD, confirms that Christians were subjected to severe persecution under Nero, describing them as people hated for their practices. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, references the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. These are not Christian sources. These are outside observers recording what was happening to this movement. The world these men were walking into was a world that wanted them silenced, permanently. And now, one by one, here is what happened to each of them. James the son of Zebedee is the only apostle whose death is recorded directly in the New Testament. That makes his account the most historically certain of all of them. Acts 12, 1-2. Records it in 2 sentences. Herod Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great, the king who had ordered the massacre of infants in Bethlehem, and nephew of Herod Antipas, the ruler who had beheaded John the Baptist, extended his persecution to the apostles. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. The Greek word translated killed here is anairio. It means to take up and carry away, to eliminate. And death by the sword in this context almost certainly means beheading. The year was approximately 44 AD. James had been following Jesus for roughly 14 years. He was the first of the 12 to die. He would not be the last. Here is what most people never realize about this moment. Acts 12:3 records that when Herod saw that the execution of James pleased the Jewish leaders, he proceeded to arrest Peter as well. The death of James was not just a tragedy. It was a political calculation. And it tells us something important, that the apostles were considered significant enough threats to be worth executing at the highest levels of regional government. Not fishermen anymore, threats. Peter's death is one of the most well-attested accounts in all of early Christian tradition. The New Testament itself hints at it. In John 21:18-19, Jesus says to Peter directly, "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." The text immediately clarifies, this he said to show by what kind of death Peter was to glorify God. Jesus is telling Peter, while Peter is still alive, that he will die by crucifixion. The Church Father Clement of Rome, writing around 96 AD, within living memory of the event, refers to Peter's martyrdom. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD, references it. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, confirms Peter was crucified, and Origen, one of the most careful scholars of the early church, records the specific detail that Peter requested to be crucified upside down, not deeming himself worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. The location is also historically anchored. The historian Eusebius, drawing on earlier sources, places Peter's execution in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero, around 64 to 68 AD. The Roman historian Tacitus independently confirms that Nero executed large numbers of Christians in Rome during this period, describing their deaths as entertainment staged in his gardens. Think about what that means for a second. The man who denied Jesus 3 times around a charcoal fire in the courtyard of the high priest, the man who swore he did not even know him, died upside down on a cross rather than renounce his name a 2nd time. Same man, completely different ending. Paul was not one of the original 12. He never met Jesus during his earthly ministry. In fact, he spent the early years of his career hunting Christians down and having them imprisoned. And then something happened on a road to Damascus that he spent the rest of his life trying to describe. Paul's death, like Peter's, is historically well supported. He himself writes in 2 Timothy 4:6-7, his final letter, written from a Roman prison, "I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." That letter reads like a man who knows exactly what is coming and has made peace with it. The early church sources are consistent. Clement of Rome references Paul's martyrdom in the same letter where he references Peter's. Tertullian confirms he was beheaded. Eusebius places the execution in Rome during Nero's persecution, around 67 AD. Beheading rather than crucifixion was consistent with Paul's status as a Roman citizen. Roman law prohibited crucifying citizens. Here is the detail most people walk right past. Paul was not killed for anything he stole, any crime he committed, any political rebellion he organized. He was killed for one claim: that a man he had never met in person had appeared to him alive on a road outside Damascus after being publicly executed by the Roman state. He gave up everything he had built, his reputation, his standing in the Jewish religious establishment, his safety, and ultimately his life, for that single claim. Not a doctrine, an event, a person. Andrew, Peter's brother, was killed in Greece according to traditions that date back to the early centuries of the church. The Acts of Andrew, written in the 2nd or 3rd century, and acknowledged by the church father Eusebius, records that Andrew was crucified in the city of Patras in the Roman province of Achaia. The tradition holds that he was bound rather than nailed to the cross, a method designed to prolong the suffering, and that he preached from the cross for 2 days before dying. The specific detail that gives this tradition some credibility is the shape of the cross. Andrew reportedly requested an X-shaped cross, known today as a saltire, again not deeming himself worthy of the same manner of death as Jesus. This detail, the X-shaped cross, is consistent across multiple independent sources and became so associated with Andrew that it has been the symbol of Scotland for centuries and appears on the Scottish flag to this day. Here is where it gets interesting. The spread of a symbol that specific, that geographically embedded, that enduring across more than 15 centuries of culture, that kind of legacy does not grow from pure legend. Legends do not leave that kind of mark on a nation's flag. Thomas presents one of the most fascinating cases in the entire list. Western traditions place his ministry in Syria, but Eastern traditions, and this is the detail that makes historians pay attention, consistently place Thomas in India. The Mar Thoma Church in the Indian state of Kerala traces its founding directly to the Apostle Thomas, claiming he arrived on the Malabar coast around 52 AD. This is not a recent claim. It is a tradition that has been continuous and unbroken in that community for nearly 2,000 years. Here is what most people never realize. Historians have confirmed that trade routes between the Roman world and India were active and well-traveled in the 1st century AD. The Greek geographer Strabo and the Roman author Pliny the Elder both document the India trade. A Jewish merchant community existed in Kerala in the ancient period. The journey was difficult but not impossible, and an unbroken community of Christians in southern India claiming apostolic founding is not the kind of thing that invents itself. The tradition of Thomas's death states he was martyred near Madras, in the area now known as Chennai, killed by spears. The hill where he is said to have died is still called St. Thomas Mount. A church has stood there since at least the 6th century. The remaining apostles, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Thaddeus, and Matthias, who replaced Judas Iscariot, all have traditions surrounding their deaths: crucifixion, beheading, stoning, being sawed in half, being flayed alive. The accounts vary, sometimes contradict each other, and some are more legend than history. Scholars are honest about the uncertainty here. The further you move from apostles like Peter and Paul, who had large communities writing about them, the thinner the historical documentation becomes. But here is what does not vary. Every single tradition, reliable or legendary, well-documented or obscure, agrees on one thing across every single apostle, none of them recanted. Not one account in any tradition from any century records an apostle saying, "It was not true, we made it up, he did not rise." They went to their deaths telling the same story they had been telling since Jerusalem. If this is helping you see the apostles in a way you have never seen them before, help someone else find it. Subscribe, leave a comment, even one word helps other people find this conversation, and share it with someone who has questions about whether any of this is real. That is genuinely how people find this content. And then there is John. John, the son of Zebedee, brother of James, the first apostle to die. John was there at the Transfiguration. He was at the Last Supper. He is the disciple described in his own gospel as the one Jesus loved. He was standing at the foot of the cross when every other male disciple had fled. And Jesus from the cross entrusted the care of his own mother to John. This is the man who outlived all of them. The early church tradition is consistent and striking. Tertullian records that John was brought to Rome and thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil and survived. Whether that account is historical or legendary, what happened next is not in serious dispute. John was exiled to the island of Patmos, a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea used by Rome as a penal colony, where he received the visions recorded in the Book of Revelation. After the death of Emperor Domitian, John was released and travelled to Ephesus on the western coast of modern Turkey, and there, according to every tradition that touches on his end, he lived to an extraordinary old age and died peacefully, naturally, in his bed. Think about what that means for a second. Every other apostle was executed. John died of old age, and yet John's Gospel, John's letters, the Book of Revelation, these are not the writings of a man who felt lucky to have survived. They are the writings of a man who had watched every person he loved most in the world die violently for the same claim he was still making decades later, with his hands shaking and his eyes still open. He did not survive because he believed less than the others. He survived because God apparently had more for him to write. Here is the deepest thing about this list. These were not soldiers trained to die for a cause. They were not fanatics who had grown up in a culture of martyrdom. They were fishermen and tax collectors and political activists who had spent 3 years following a teacher and then watched him die. They had a weekend of absolute despair, and then something happened that turned every single one of them into men who could not be silenced by prison, flogging, exile, or execution. The Greek word for witness is martes. It is where we get the word martyr. In the early church, the two words became almost interchangeable, because to be a witness to the resurrection was more often than not to eventually die for saying so. John 15:13 records Jesus saying, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." Every apostle on this list eventually answered that verse with their own life. Not for a system of beliefs, not for an institution, for a person, for the specific claim that they had seen him alive after he was dead. That is the list. 12 men, 1 replacement, 1 late addition, almost all of them killed, one of them surviving into old age, and every single one of them, right up until the moment it cost them everything, still telling the same story. You do not have to resolve every historical uncertainty in this list to feel the weight of what it represents. You do not have to be certain about whether Thomas reached India or exactly which type of cross Andrew died on. What you do have to reckon with is this: a movement built on the claim that a man rose from the dead did not survive because it was politically convenient, or socially comfortable, or safe. It survived because the people who were in the best position to know whether it was true, the people who had been in the room, on the road, at the tomb, refused to say otherwise even when refusing cost them everything. If you have ever struggled with doubt, if you have ever looked at the claims of Christianity and wondered whether there is any real reason to believe any of it, this list is not a proof, but it is a question worth sitting with. What did these men know that made what they were dying for feel more real than their own survival? James died first, around 44 AD, with the sword. Peter died last among the early martyrs, upside down on a cross in Rome, around 68 AD. And somewhere between those two deaths, in cities and regions across the ancient world, 11 other men made the same choice. The one who made it to old age did not make it because he chose differently. He made it because he was asked to stay behind and keep writing, and we are still reading what he wrote. If this study meant something to you, if this list of names landed differently today than it ever has before, the single most helpful thing you can do is subscribe. Every video on this channel goes this carefully into the people and events behind the text. Leave a comment. It can be just one word. Even a single word in the comments helps other people find this conversation, and there are people out there wrestling with exactly these questions who need to find it. Share it with someone who thinks faith is for people who have never asked hard questions. Share it with someone who grew up in church and walked away. Share it with someone who has always wondered whether any of this is historically real. God bless you, and please keep us in your prayers.